Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Okay, today we're unpacking one of the most incredible and honestly kind of paradoxical stories in human history. It's the story of how humanity literally engineered its way out of an impending global catastrophe, only to turn around and build an entirely new, incredibly complex trap in the process. We are, of course, talking about the Green Revolution. Okay, let's dive into this. If you were sitting around in the mid 20th century, the global outlook was, frankly, terrifying. You had demographers looking at population growth charts and comparing them to crop yields, and the math just did not add up. Widespread, catastrophic mass famine in places like Southeast Asia and sub-Saharan Africa wasn't just considered a possibility. Experts viewed it as an absolute inevitability. You had books coming out like Paul Ehrlich's The Population Bomb, predicting that hundreds of millions of people would starve to death in the 1970s. The world desperately needed a miracle just to feed its booming population. And you know what? That miracle actually happened. And it largely came down to the tireless work of one man, an American agronomist named Norman Borlaug. Borlaug is credited with saving an estimated 1 billion lives from famine. Just let that number sink in for a second. 1 billion people. For his world-altering work, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970, and to this very day, he remains the only agricultural scientist to ever receive that honor. So how exactly did he pull this off? Well, it all started back in 1944, when Borlaug arrived in Mexico for a Rockefeller Foundation program. At the time, Mexican wheat yields were incredibly low. We're talking an average of a mere 750 kilograms per hectare. Borlaug noticed a really frustrating problem. When you gave traditional tall wheat extra fertilizer, the plants grew lush and top-heavy, and then they would just snap and fall over, a process farmers call lodging, which completely ruined the harvest. His absolute genius solution was to breed semi-dwarf varieties. These were shorter, with thick, stiff stems that could actually bear the weight of massive grain heads. They were also highly resistant to stem rust, which is a devastating fungal disease, and they could grow at almost any latitude. The result? Staggering. Mexican wheat production absolutely skyrocketed by more than 600%. So the crucial point is, Borlaug's miracle seeds didn't work in isolation. You couldn't just toss them in the dirt and walk away. They required a very specific, coordinated package of 5 mutually reinforcing technologies to actually produce those massive yields. Think of it like a giant jigsaw puzzle. You needed the high-yield varieties of crops, sure, but you also absolutely needed synthetic nitrogen fertilizer to feed them, heavy mechanization to plant and harvest them at scale, vastly expanded irrigation to water them, and commercial pesticides to protect them. Together, this exact package of technologies formed what we now call the Green Revolution. Let's zoom in on the second piece of that puzzle, because it fundamentally changed our planet, the Haber-Bosch process. Before this process was fully commercialized around 1913, traditional farming was strictly limited by nature's nitrogen cycle. Farmers had to rely on spreading manure, planting legumes, or even mining guano just to get biologically available nitrogen into the soil. Haber-Bosch changed the game. It's a highly energy-intensive industrial process that literally takes nitrogen gas right out of the atmosphere and converts it into ammonia. Just like that, overnight, humanity completely decoupled crop yields from the natural constraints of the biological nitrogen cycle. To really understand just how deeply this single technology transformed our world, think about this for a second. Approximately 50% of all the nitrogen atoms in the proteins of your very own body right now passed through a Haber-Bosch plant before ever entering the food chain. We are literally built out of this industrial process. That is the sheer mind-boggling scale of this global food system transformation. Now, another vital piece of the puzzle was water. These high-yield seeds were super thirsty, which led to a massive expansion of irrigation into semi-arid regions. And it created this fascinating paradox. Today, irrigated land makes up only about 20% of all global cropland, but it punches way, way above its weight, producing roughly 40% of the world's food. Supplemental water was absolutely essential to making the whole green revolution work. When you put all these pieces together, the aggregate productivity triumph was just staggering. Global average wheat yields surged from roughly 1 ton per hectare in the 1950s to over 3.5 tons by the early 2000s. That's an increase of over 250%, and we accomplished it without needing a corresponding expansion of cultivated land. Over in Asia, new rice varieties, like the famous IR8 released in 1966, saw yields roughly triple. World cereal production more than doubled, entirely outpacing global population growth. And those feared apocalyptic mass famines of the 1960s, they simply never happened. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the hidden cost behind all this success. In implementing the Green Revolution, humanity made a profound trade-off. We essentially traded long-term resilience for short-term productivity. We took these highly diverse, adaptable agricultural networks and replaced them with a highly optimized, low-redundancy system. Yes, it is incredibly efficient at churning out calories, but as a result, it's also dangerously fragile. One of the absolute primary drivers of this fragility is monoculture. This is the practice of planting an immense field with a single genetically uniform crop variety. Now, monocultures are amazing if you want to maximize your mechanization and your yield per hour of labor. But because you are planting massive areas of genetic clones, you completely eliminate the natural ecological buffering that biodiversity provides. It basically acts like an endless, all-you-can-eat buffet for novel pests and pathogens. And that is exactly why the Green Revolution required such heavy use of commercial pesticides just to survive. And history gives us a pretty terrifying parallel for what happens when a monoculture fails. Think back to the Irish potato famine of 1845. Nearly all Irish potatoes at the time belonged to a single clonal variety called the lumper. So when a new pathogen arrived, it swept through the entire country with absolutely nothing to stop it. Because modern commercial wheat and corn are built on such a phenomenally narrow genetic base, we face an analogous global risk today. A single novel rust strain or corn blight could potentially spread worldwide way before scientists even have time to breed resistance into the crops. Beyond those biological vulnerabilities, there are massive environmental costs literally hidden beneath our feet. Remember that huge expansion in irrigation we talked about? Well, heavily irrigated regions rely heavily on underground aquifers, pumping water that took thousands of years to accumulate. Today, crucial water sources like the Ogallala Aquifer here in the US and the North China Plain Aquifer are basically being mined. We are pumping water out vastly faster than nature can ever recharge it, which means that irrigated farming in these critical global breadbaskets might become entirely impossible within our own lifetimes. And even when we do have the water, irrigation brings another silent killer to the party: soil salinization. Irrigation water naturally carries dissolved salts. When fields don't drain perfectly, the water evaporates under the sun and just leaves those salts behind in the root zone. Over time, it completely destroys the soil's ability to grow crops. Today, an estimated 20 to 30% of the world's irrigated land is already degraded by this salt buildup. If this sounds familiar, it's because it's the exact same slow poisoning that completely collapsed the ancient agricultural systems in the Mesopotamian river valleys thousands of years ago. And this brilliantly illustrates perhaps the most precarious shift of all. Before industrial agriculture, farming was fundamentally a solar-powered endeavor. Today, our food system is powered almost entirely by fossil fuels. Between the immense energy required to run the Haber-Bosch fertilizer plants, fuel the massive tractors, run the irrigation pumps, and transport the harvest, modern food systems in developed nations actually consume 7 to 10 fossil fuel calories just to deliver one single food calorie to a consumer. It is a wildly precarious, ecologically expensive ratio. Furthermore, by standardizing our crops globally for maximum yield, we're actively overwriting thousands of years of agricultural history. The localized, traditional crop varieties that got displaced by the Green Revolution were perfectly adapted to handle marginal soils, severe droughts, and endemic local pests. We're rapidly losing this vast genetic library of indigenous crop diversity, and that's a library that holds the very genetic traits we might desperately need to adapt to a changing global climate in the near future. Let's move to and see how this builds into the next phase. As the limits of this first Green Revolution become dangerously obvious, many are now looking to genetically modified organisms, or GMOs, as the foundation of a second Green Revolution. GMOs involve directly inserting or altering specific DNA sequences to confer highly desired traits. We're talking about things like Bt crops that express their own insect resistance, Roundup-ready crops engineered for herbicide tolerance, or golden rice, which is engineered to produce essential nutrients like beta-carotene. Naturally, this technology is the subject of fierce debate. Proponents argue that GMOs are our absolute best path to achieving a second massive productivity wave, doing so without expanding our agricultural footprint and having to clear more forests. Critics, on the other hand, raise very serious concerns about long-term ecological effects, the rapid consolidation of corporate control over global seed supplies, and unintended gene flow into the wild. Now, just to be completely clear on the science, major impartial assessments, like the one by the National Academies of Sciences in 2016, reflect a consensus that approved GMO crops do not pose health risks greater than conventional foods. However, the socioeconomic and ecological impacts of how they are actually deployed out in the real world remain incredibly hotly contested. Which finally leaves us here. When Norman Borlaug accepted his Nobel Peace Prize back in 1970, he actually didn't take a victory lap. Instead, he issued a stark warning. He warned the world that the Green Revolution was only a temporary success, and that population growth would inevitably overtake these immense productivity gains. So, as we look back at the incredible efficiency, but also the terrifying fragility of the modern food system we've built, we are left with a massive, lingering question. Can we achieve a second productivity wave to feed our future without repeating the catastrophic ecological mistakes of the first? It's a question the whole world, and literally the food on our plates, desperately depends on. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and remember to always keep questioning the systems around you.